Welcome everyone. It is 4 and we have quite a bit to get through today, so let's get started. I know this might be lunchtime for all of you. I'm pretty Zoom relaxed, so if you would like to eat your lunch, that's fine. I have no issue with that as well, but if you want to keep your cameras off, we can do that as well too. I'm going to share my screen for real. There we go. Stop sharing. Try that again. Show all windows. Okay. Great. So a bit of a warning. I don't like talking at people for long periods of time, so this is definitely going to be a situation where I invite your voices in, but there is a lot that I'm going to go through a little bit today. So to frame this conversation, we're going to be looking at the Artist Thrive tool, but specifically we're focusing on the section as it relates to power and exploring that concept as individuals and institutions, and even more specifically, how to engage with this piece of the rubric longitudinally and sustainably. These are big topics that we're going to be talking about and touching on. We're not going to have time to get into it all today. And so really it's more about thinking, how can we dismantle, explore, shift our thoughts and our institutional opinions and strategies and structures and systems around power in a way that is sustainable. So we're going to talk a little bit about the tool itself. We'll look at that power piece, and then we'll talk about some strategies. And I'd love to open up and hear from you all about how you may or have been confronting some of these issues. Before we do that, I'd like to kind of ground us with an invitation to brave space. Together, over the next half hour, we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world, we all carry scars and have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect, and it will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. That comes to us from Nikki Scott Bay Jones. Doop, doop, doop. Introductions. Let's see, how many of us are on this call? I think what might work best here is if we, in the chat, can quickly say just our names, our pronouns, and where we're coming from, both location-wise and also organizationally, institutionally, etc. So feel free to put those in the chat. We are truly coming from everywhere. I'm loving this. Fantastic. A little bit about myself. My name is Iceberg Model, he, him, his, and I'm the executive director of Dunamis. And it seems like we might need to mute someone. Let's see. If you can all mute, just in case you have not yet. Thank you. Okay. Great. Jay Connell, he, him, his, the executive director of Dunamis. And our work at Dunamis is all about supporting and uplifting emerging artists and arts managers of color in the city. Dunamis is pronounced Dunamis. And it directly translates to the capacity to be in a different and more completed state. So a fun thing, I was doing a presentation about Dunamis and lifting up the power portion of the tool, and I made a connection that I hadn't before. Dunamis directly translates, it's a Greek word, and the actual direct translation is power. And specifically, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, really brought this term into a more light, and he talked about Dunamis being the power of something's potential, and he really used it to describe potentiality. And his example was the acorn and the oak tree. Something's ability to transform into something else while also being both what it is and what it can be. And so the acorn wasn't powerful because it is also an oak tree. It was powerful because it had the ability to shift and become one. And so I want to frame today's conversation as saying power can sometimes, especially as we look at it institutionally, feel like an overwhelming thing to be dismantling and looking at. But the true power that we all have is the ability to change. You all being here, your willingness to be in this space, to be in community with each other, to take a look at these concepts already means that you're buying into the concept of Dunamis and recognizing the power you all have to create and facilitate change in your organizations. A little bit more about us. We ignite agency and transformative growth for emerging artists and arts managers of color by serving as a nexus for professional development, community building, consultation, production, advocacy, and developing equitable pipelines for access and leadership in creative spaces. In short, we do a lot for a small amount of people. We give folks the support they need to grow into a greater and more complete version of themselves. If you would like to learn more about us, feel free to follow us at the information you can find at the bottom, at Dunamis Boston. You can email us at info@dunamisboston.org or visit our website at www.dunamisboston.org. So a little bit about Artist Hive. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. You guys are here at the conference. I'm going to assume that you know a little bit about the tool, but I also know that some of you have yet to use the tool, so I did want to have a moment to discuss it. I like to think about Artist Thrive as a navigation system. It lets us kind of see where we are in our work. It helps us frame very specifically and give us specific language to know where we want to go, and then also think about what's important to measure as we're looking at the work that we're doing. It also talks about ways that we can improve that are beneficial to everybody. It can be used in a couple different ways. We use this a lot as kind of a grounding tool for our artists when they first come into the space. So how can it be used for self-improvement? How can it be used to improve our organizations? How can we take a lot of these tools, either saying, well, 8 organizations have done this, and these are some of the pieces that are coming out of each of those that speak to there being clearly a systemic barrier or a systemic issue. How do we now advocate on behalf of changing all of that? And then collaboration. How do we work together to address some of these issues? How you can use it as an individual. Start a group. Go through the survey together, and that group can be interdisciplinary, and I find it actually works best when it is. So get some artists together, get some arts administrators together, get some folks who are not arts administrators at all, who don't necessarily even think of their work as being related to the arts. People may be in housing or in transportation, things that do actually work with artists, but folks don't usually think with that level of specificity in regards to that audience. And so a lot of cool things kind of come up when we come together from various backgrounds and go through this tool together. Picking a category or row and creating an action plan for yourself, and then sharing your experiences. If at any point you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Someone will let me know because I can't see all of your boxes right now. But yes, just stop me if you need to. So the iceberg model. It's another thing I like to think about as we start to explore power. So we know that knowledge and skills are the visible thing, right? The what you do, the present, I like to call it the presenting problem. What you do is what we see. A layer underneath that's not always visible are what you think, the opinions and values that folks have. And underneath that is what drives you. What do you want? And so sometimes we find that when we look at power, when we look at change that needs to be made, We only look at the presenting problem. And sometimes we don't do enough work to dig deeper and say, how did we get here? What are the 6 levels that come before that we have to address to get here? Maybe it's not just that this program isn't serving this group. Maybe it's because we don't even think of that audience here. We don't value them here. And because we don't value them here, we don't create a system that allows us to create programs that serve them, right? So thinking sometimes about having to do the deeper work and really getting down into what you want. What are the driving factors of our organization? What are our values? And then how does that come up above the surface in the work that we're doing and presenting to other folks? What I will say is when we see folks beginning with the presenting problem, sometimes, especially as a person of color, when I watch this thing happen, the reflex of, oh, we're hiring a new DEI person, or, oh, we've hired someone else who's a person of color to fill this role. And for us, it looks very clearly like you're tackling the presenting problem, and we wonder what's happening under the surface. But what I will say is, and my theater background's gonna sneak out a little bit right now, there's 2 methods of thought when it comes to acting. There's the inside out model that says, I need to go back into an experience that I felt in my life, touch into my own personal history, find the places in my body where my joy lives, or my anger lives, or my sorrow lives, and I pull from that inside, and that's how I can now shift into the character and present this energy outwards. There's also another model, though, that says, let me move my body, let me put these clothes on, let me fix the external, and then that will summon within me the internal things that can help me get into this role and play this part. So sometimes it's the outside in. So what we're talking about here, as well, it's always important to do that inside work. Sometimes you might have to start on the outside. You might have to take that presenting issue and then let it influence getting in there. You might need to have someone just at the table. That might be the first step you have to take. So while obviously we would preach, and I lean more to saying, make sure that you're doing this inside out work, sometimes it can be beneficial to start from the outside in, as long as that's intentional and as long as that's known that that is the first step in a much longer process. Any questions so far? I know I've been talking a lot. Great, gonna keep going. Okay. So here's the tool. This is half of it as it relates to power. This will be over 2 slides. And obviously we have give up all the way to thrive. The one I actually want to focus on right now, because hopefully you all have access to the full tool, is the second row, because I feel like it really speaks to the heart of this tool and the heart of how we can be using this tool as it relates to power. So in Give Up, we have our approach reinforces structural inequities, systemic injustice, exclusionary conditions, and implicit bias in programs and offerings, employment, and/or community interaction. In struggle, we have our lack of capacity, whether that be financial, personnel, organizational, etc., to translate our intentions to be open, equitable, and culturally relevant directly and indirectly perpetuates structural inequities, systemic injustice, etc. And survive. With adequate capacity, we have begun to translate our intentions to be open, equitable, and culturally relevant, and we are taking steps to address and/or shift structural inequities, etc. And lastly, in Thrive, with high capacity, we are adept at translating our intentions to be open, equitable, and culturally relevant, and we are leaders in removing structural inequities, systemic injustice, exclusionary conditions, and implicit bias in programs and offerings. The way I like to break this down is that in Give Up, you are fully complicit. As an organization, you are practicing and actively reinforcing the negative practices that relate to injustice. In Struggle, it's not that you're actively trying, but you have systems in place that allow these things to thrive, and you're perpetuating these systems, even if it's not necessarily your intent. In Survive, you've begun to figure out how to shift these things internally. You're working to change your organization and to address those things that are happening within the place that you are. And then in Thrive, it's now external. It's about the sector. It's how can we remove these barriers everywhere. So one is I'm actively participating in the dysfunction. 2 is I'm participating in it, whether actively or inactively, because of how we're built. 3 is we've kind of worked to take care of what's happening internally, but Thrive says now we're focusing on how to shift this for everybody else. And I would say that in language that we've been talking about a lot recently in terms of power is the difference between allyship and active anti-racism, right? And in Survive, that might be allyship. You know, we're doing really good on our place, we're supporting, but it's that active piece of how am I sacrificing my power, or how am I using my power to actively change these systems? That's what the Thrive piece is. And I don't want us to lose that. Thrive is about us all. Thrive is a community piece. Thrive says, how do we work together in coalition to dismantle these systems to build a better world? Surviving, the baseline, the fine, is we're doing okay over here, but if an artist is coming to engage with our organization and they're fine here, but they're not fine over there, we haven't done enough. And that's why we're not thriving, because it says that we don't value them enough to make sure no matter how they move in this world and this sector, we're gonna show up for them. Any questions yet? I keep throwing a lot at you guys. I know someone's gotta have some feelings. Are we all in agreement? Okay, someone's coming up in the chat. Yes. Okay, great. We're having a mind meld, everybody. Cool. So the other things I want to lift up, just in terms of specific things that we can be looking at as it relates to power, is this middle row here on the second half of the power category. On a practical level, our programs and offerings fail to take into account the diversity of needs around geography, time of day, transportation, childcare, affordability, learning differences. So right now, why I love this tool so much is we're getting language. We're getting really specific language, because how often as we engage in reflection and looking at the work that we're doing, do we think about some of these pieces? When are our things happening? Where are our things happening? How will folks get to us, just transportation-wise? What are we doing about childcare? One thing that was really interesting to me growing up around people of color is how for everything we had, there, whether it be a political forum to a community meeting, there is somebody there who's going to take all the kids and watch them. Because to not have access to that is a barrier for folks to come into these spaces, right? And so how do we think about that when we're setting our orientation sessions, when we're setting our meeting times, when we're setting all of these things? How are we thinking about childcare and how that can happen? And that's, again, how we move into the Survive and Thrive pieces. Are these things affordable? I think we usually have those discussions around affordability, sometimes around time of day and geography, but this gives us very specific language to be thinking about how we can be developing equitable practices. Are there any more specific things that you guys have been thinking about as it relates to developing these equitable practices? Kind of as it relates to the childcare and transportation, the things that you've been thinking about in your orgs? As you guys think, I know one thing that comes up a lot in education and in the best spaces is culture. How does someone's culture affect how they present in these educational spaces? When I was right out of college, the first job that I had was using music to teach literacy and English language to middle school students. And they were English language learners from several different countries, several different languages. And one of the first things that we had to learn was things like raising your hand, looking you in the eye. All of those things might be different. And if you address them or look at those things through a very specific lens and say, well, you're being disrespectful because you're not looking me in the eye, sometimes it's no. To do that in their culture is disrespectful. So now having to, in the lessons you design, and even thinking about how you facilitate in the room, being aware of the different cultures that might be at play, and how those things kind of come across is another thing to be thinking about. Okay, got 10 minutes left. I'm gonna move to the last piece, and we'll for sure open up. So, it came in the chat. Ebony says, my program is based on delivering cultural experiences close to where residents live for some of these very reasons as it relates to access. The majority of the programs for seniors take place midday because time of day plays a major factor in why they do or don't engage. That's great. And again, it shows that you're thinking about their needs, about their particular resources, and designing things in response to that. And that gets a little bit into the human-centered design thinking, right? Who is your audience? What do they need? What are their behaviors? And then how do you work backwards from there? So I like to think human-centered design and backwards design. How do you work backwards from there to say, well, this is now how we design our programs. This is then how we design the structure and workflows that are happening in our work, by thinking about our constituency first. And this goes back to kind of that iceberg example of who is our audience? Who do we value? Who are we trying to get to? Why are we trying to get to them? And if we center our most vulnerable in those conversations at the very deepest level of our thinking, then that allows us to be able to create systems and structures and programs that speak to that powerfully. So lastly, I've been speaking with a lot of different orgs about this power piece, and sustainability is a thing that comes up. A recent poll came out that says an ever-increasing number of folks are no longer on board with the protests that are happening in response to the racial injustice in this country. And it's because people are tired. And particularly some white people are tired. It was like, yes, this thing happened, and we thought, and it was loud. And then we began mired in the politicizing of even how the protest works, even though I believe it was a number like 94% of protests were peaceful. Even feeling like they had to be peaceful is one thing, but now we're tired. It was like we were doing the work and things haven't changed, and my kids are back in school, I have work to do. This is a lot. This is a lot. And these orgs, right at the height of this, were like, yes, we're going to make these new responses. We're going to have these new initiatives. We're going to have these community conversations with our staff and our team. And people are just like, okay, but we're tired. We're still doing this. I still have to figure out how to incorporate this into my work. I think that first and foremost in our organizations, we have to be honest about that. We have to be honest and transparent of just like, this feels like a lot to me. Skipping to point one, that does not, however, mean that we get to disengage from the work. The biggest issue as it relates to power is feeling like once we've dismantled it, we've won. Feeling like we're at the end of the book, we've slayed the dragon, now we get to live happily ever after. That is not how this works. And we have to be really clear in our organizations that there is no goalpost. There is no finish, there is no done. This is life work. And by thinking about it in this longitudinal way, we then have to think about, well, then how do we engage in life work in a way that's sustainable? Maybe it means that we can't do the big drama every month because that's not something that we can continue 3, 5, 10, 15 years down the road. If this is life work, then we have to be thinking about what are we doing in 3 years? What are we doing in 5 years? What are those markers that we want to be seeing? And how do we do a little bit of this every day so that there isn't burnout? Because there are some of us who've been dealing with this for centuries, for thousands of years, and we still have to do that. And so really dismantling power is an eternal process. It will always be a thing that we have to be doing. Then we get into the formative versus summative ways that we look at our work. We're very used to the end of year reviews, end of year reflections, giving out surveys to our audiences at the end of specific seasons, or if we have participants coming into the things, it's the end of year. How was it? How did it work? But if you find ways, and I'll share some examples in a moment, if we find ways to be consistently building pipelines and systems that ask and invite voice for the people that we're working with, it doesn't feel like it's just a thing that happens at the end of the year. If it's no matter when it is, you have access to me, or you have access to me in a way that feels safe for you. And so we were talking with a theater company and they were saying, well, we want to have a box that's just there that people can always be putting things into that just says, hey, here's a suggestion. Because it doesn't always feel safe to be sharing those spaces, which brings us to our next point. The reflex for a lot of our organizations having to meet this power moment has been to bring folks in. We say, let's invite more people to our table. The sustainability piece says, have you created a space where they can stay and be seen and thrive? So just because you've now brought in a person of color into your space, if there are still, again, beneath the iceberg, beneath the surface of the water, there's still those practices, those behaviors, those ideologies that are not safe for them, they will not be effective. They will not be able to create change. And then all you've done is a token thing that doesn't allow somebody to thrive and doesn't allow the work to change. So as you think about bringing people into this space, it's not just how do we have more visibility, how do we give them a seat at this table, it's how do we create a space where they can thrive, be seen, and stay, and invite more people into. And then lastly, how do you sequence out aspects of the work in a long-term way? If we go back to, and I'll look in the chat in a moment, if we go back to this is a lot. This is a lot of things to be taking part of. And so maybe you say for 3 months, we're only focusing on one square out of this rubric. We're gonna dig down and we're gonna focus on one square. Maybe for this year or the next 2 years, we're gonna focus on one row of it. Feeling like we have to take this rubric, understand it all, and make all of these changes simultaneously is not going to be sustainable. So really think about what are the conversations that are inspired by the work that we're doing that come out by going through this rubric, and how can we sequence them? How do we make this longitudinal, again, and committing and understanding that this is ongoing lifetime work. Okay, I see some things in the chat. Let me go back to the other slide just in case they're about that. Oh no, it won't let me see the chat. Here we go. Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left. So in this piece, I would love to hear in the last few minutes how this has been working for your organizations. Have you been engaging in this work? Do you feel like it's sustainable? What have your worries been around the sustainability of looking at power, etc.? And this can either be in the chat or you guys can unmute and share out that way as well.
Yeah, folks are welcome to put on their video too at this point.
I will actually stop sharing my screen.
Jay, you bring a lot of really great points. I don't know your first name, I'm sorry, I just got in, but I really can understand from experience being in that position of creating the space to be seen, heard, and thrive. Like, you know, that, I mean, that's the old conversation, like diversity, that's just space time. But can y'all be real with the fact, like, are they heard, and can they thrive, and can they continue to be honest and participate? But now you're uncomfortable or whatever. But I love so much of what you're saying. It's right on point. And I'd love to hear from organizations, directors, assistant directors, programmers. How's it going? I know you're tired. Ain't that the truth? Everybody's like, oh, I'm tired now. Well, other people don't get to quit being Native, Indigenous, Black, or whatever, or trans, or, you know, so we not tired, we us, but can we, how can you all sustain in being, you know, partners on the planet with us?
Thank you so much, Mitzi. And even thinking about that, when you are the person of color that comes into that space, how can you survive there? Because you have that expectation now, feeling like, oh, I have to be the change, right? I now have to be the one who goes about this process. So when thinking about, again, the inclusivity, about setting folks up to thrive, how are you thinking about that in your organizations to make that happen? A lot to digest, a lot to digest. So if all this does today is spark some thinking, that would be a success for sure.
But I love that piece that says that this is life work, and that it doesn't go away, because chances are none of us are going to be good at this ever, because this is something that we're not good at as humans. We are not good with power and supremacy. And so it's going to take us all our lives to get somewhere.
some things coming up in the chat. We're working to apply this dismantling of power, an idea of thriving to our internal community, staff and board, as well as our artist community. This work has to be sustained, otherwise it's not useful. For me, working at a government agency, this work and power transfer is deeply connected to transparency in all aspects of what my agency does. That's a great point. I mean, we're talking a little bit about bringing folks in and the external piece, but again, and looking at that underneath the iceberg part, a lot of this work is internal. A lot of this work is what's happening here on our board, on our staff, on our even funding streams. How are we thinking about these things? So we have 1 minute left. And again, you have access to me if you'd like. I'm going to put my information in the chat here. And I want to leave us with a quote that has been kind of helping me think through and get through these times, and can hopefully be helpful to you all in this season of our work and in our lives. And it says, I choose the discipline of hope over the ease of cynicism. I choose fortitude over fatalism. I choose to be who my ancestors protected and my creator formed. I choose strategy and organizing as the container for my anger. I choose to be more than a conqueror. And that comes to us from Brittany Packett. So I take this all with you again. I'm so happy that you all are here. You all are engaging in this very important work, and I applaud you for stepping into this and thinking about how to do this over the long term in a way that is sustainable for both you, your organizations, and the communities that you're serving. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference. And I personally will see you all tomorrow to close this all out.